Four Spheres of Knowledge Creation. The Causal Principles by René Holmbjerg Bøtker. Chapter 14. Modular and Architectural Knowledge. We meet the positive-negative taxonomy with the philosopher Hegel. The description of the taxonomy was to some extent a counter-argument to the idea of the artist being able to use tacit knowledge to represent a noumenal entity. Hegel was in agreement with Schopenhauer's idea that presented the possibility of artists having the ability to gain an insight into the noumenal world. However, he argued that the lack of self-awareness needed to have the artistic insight was a very rare quality, which only very few possessed. Explained through the terminology of this book, Hegel argued that the tacit knowledge of the artist would often become explicit through the self-awareness of the artist. The knowledge would thereby not be a representation of a noumenal entity, but a representation of the object and its existence as a phenomenal construct. The argument was that the self-awareness of the artist would cause the object to be perceived relative to other objects in the awareness of the artist. The existence of an object in the self-awareness of an observer exists as a negative, where knowledge of the object is connected to its existence in relation to other objects. What Hegel is presenting in this argument is the negative representation of an object as a consequence of the architecture which delineates it, i.e., the object as a phenomenal construct situated in the shared boundaries, which was formed in the actualization process. These shared boundaries form an architectural structure in which the object positions itself as a module, hence the name of the architectural and modular taxonomy. Hegel never causally explains why the tacit-explicit taxonomy would be connected to the negative delineation of an object. Although I believe that the negative and explicit taxonomies are often connected, it seems as though there is little to no logical reason for this to be so. At least not other than the fact that it might be a bias of the human being, which would make it a psychological or sociological inquiry, not a causal inquiry. The interesting element here is therefore not the connection between explicit and architectural knowledge, but the architectural taxonomy as a negative delineating feature. The modular architectural taxonomy concerns knowledge, which is represented as the delineation of the boundaries of an object. The delineation of boundaries takes place through the actualization process, where potential objects are distinguished from each other through the extension and property of the actualized objects. The modular architectural taxonomy therefore concerns the extension of an actualized object, whereby it can be differentiated from other actualized objects through delineation. This delineation represents the shared boundary between two objects. The boundary between two objects emerges in the actualization process, where two objects share a boundary. It is through the structure of boundaries that emerges between actualized objects that we are able to delineate the extension of the object and position it among other objects. The pre-established harmony facilitates the positioning of objects relative to each other. The pre-established harmony enables a perceiving object to recognize a particular phenomenal representation of the expressing object. The delineation of an object is therefore twofold as both a positive and negative boundary. The negative boundary represents the perceiving object. The negative boundary delineates an object through the boundaries that emerges in the actualization process as the structures between actualized objects. It is a representation of the perceiving object in the actualization process and represents the recognized property which exists in the perceiving object. The negative boundary is exclusive to the property and ability of recognition in the perceiving object. The positive boundary represents the expressing object, which is being delineated, and the inherent property that constitutes the possibility for interaction, and thereby the creation of a shared boundary. The possibility of delineation as a shared boundary is predicated on the pre-established harmony, which facilitates the interaction. As the pre-established harmony is an infinite harmony that allows all objects to interact, positive delineation is not exclusive to the perceiving object in the actualization process. The positive delineation represents possible boundaries that the property of an object can have in all actualization processes with other objects. The infinite pre-established harmony, therefore, allows an object to include all possible boundaries through positive delineation. Objects as modular and architectural knowledge. In the architecture of the pre-established harmony, the potential objects exist as modules, which phenomenally composes the architecture that allows actualized objects to have shared boundaries in the phenomenal world. A potential object is always capable of interacting with another potential object, as the property of the potential objects are both infinite and undifferentiated. The interaction between potential objects constitutes the actualization process that forms a shared boundary that corresponds to the pre-established harmony, where they are differentiated from each other as two actualized objects. An actualized object is a particular analog representation of the potential object. It is therefore a representation of the noumenal realm and the property of the potential object. An actualized object has undergone the actualization process through which it has formed a shared boundary with another object. The shared boundaries between objects constitutes an architectural structure. The architecture of the phenomenal world is constituted by the shared boundaries of actualized objects. An actualized object can share boundaries with other actualized objects if it is in harmony with the other actualized object. An object cannot share boundaries with another actualized object if it is not in harmony with the other actualized object. Positive delineation constitutes the actualized object as a module, which is compatible with other objects as an entity capable of undergoing actualization processes that is facilitated by the pre-established harmony. This constitutes positive delineation as modular as it represents the actualized object as a module in the architecture, that is, the pre-established harmony. A modular object is a representation of itself as an independent entity, where the positive delineation is a phenomenal representation of the noumenal property of the actualized object. The modular object is therefore a particular representation of the potential object that constitutes the actualized object with potential shared boundaries to all phenomenal objects in either the spatial or temporal dimension. The boundaries of an actualized object are always shared with other objects. It is the shared boundaries that facilitate interaction between objects by enabling expressions and perceptions to be exchanged. The structures of shared boundaries constitute an architecture with the pre-established harmony through which actualized objects can position themselves among each other. Negative delineation constitutes the actualized object as an entity delineated by the architectural structure of shared boundaries which it shares with other objects as an entity that has already undergone the actualization process. Negative delineation is a particular representation of the property, which was exchanged in the actualization process. This constitutes the negative object as architectural as it represents the actualized object as the architecture that facilitated one specific actualization process. An architectural object is a representation of an object as a dependent entity, where the negative delineation is a phenomenal representation of the perceived property of the actualized object. An architectural object is therefore a particular representation of the potential object that interacted with the actualized object. An architectural object does not have potential shared boundaries with other objects, as it is a representation dependent on the objects with which the architectural object has interacted. Spatial and temporal objects. A potential object does not share boundaries, and all shared boundaries exist between actualized phenomenal objects. The actualization process brings the potential object into the phenomenal realm and actualizes the shared boundaries, which brings about a phenomenal representation of the object. A potential object exists as an infinite amount of indivisible immaterial points. The immaterial points which compose a potential object, are undifferentiated from the immaterial points which compose other potential objects. A modular object, therefore, contains knowledge of other potential objects through its own existence as a potential object. As such, it is independent of any specific objects. An architectural object is represented through the actualized shared boundaries with other objects in the spatial dimension or other representations of itself in the temporal dimension. The architectural delineation is therefore a representation of shared boundaries that have been actualized, but not of all potential shared boundaries. The delineation is a particular boundary that exists only in the relations between actualized objects and therefore represents the phenomenal architecture as an analog representation of the pre-established harmony. Any delineation of an object is phenomenal, and the phenomenal representation of objects is an analog representation of the noumenal world, which has been subject to the actualization process with another spatial object. As such, there is no difference between a spatial and temporal modular object other than the architectural structures of objects with which it shares a dimension. The only difference consists of whether the object is delineated as a module or an architecture. It is still a representation of potential boundaries with which the object can engage in an actualization process with another object or another representation of itself. The question that is interesting to discuss in terms of knowledge creation is whether the knowledge of an object exists as a dependent or independent entity. A modular object is delineated through its property as an independent object that exists phenomenally as an analog representation of the pre-established harmony. The knowledge of a modular object is represented objectively as, but not subjected to any phenomenal structures. This situates the modular object as an independent object, which is not subject to any particular recognition of a perceiving object. The architectural object is delineated through its representation as a phenomenal object, which has undergone the actualization process. This situates the architectural object as a dependent object, which is subject to recognition of the perceiving object, which was present in the actualization process. The shared boundary of a modular object is a representation of the pre-established harmony of the noumenal world, which, as an analog in the phenomenal world, facilitates the shared boundaries between objects. A modular object is therefore compatible with all objects in the phenomenal world and is therefore not subject to any architectural structures. As an independent entity, the modular object is explorative as new shared boundaries reveal the delineation of an object relative to the actualization processes, which the modular object engages in with other objects. An architectural object, on the other hand, is bound to the objects which has facilitated architectural structures from which it is delineated. The architectural structures, although an analog representation of the pre-established harmony, is a particular analog representation of the boundaries as they exist in the property of the perceiving object. As such, any boundaries which can be attributed to the architectural object is dependent on exploiting the particular architectural structures which the architectural object is bound to. If the boundary with other objects is compatible with the pre-existing architectural structures, there will be no conflicts of compatibility. However, because of the particular nature of architectural objects, compatibility is not certain.